This is a summary of 3 essays that can be found in this book here. Each one is written by a different author. First, there's one by Linda Badham. Second, Donald Mackay. And third, Stephen T. Davis. So let's go ahead and begin with Linda Badham's chapter entitled A Naturalistic Case for Extinction. Her thesis is, quote, "The implications of modern science are far more damaging to doctrines of life after death than many Christian writers have supposed." So she's going to consider 3 objections from modern science against the Christian doctrine that we will survive the death of our bodies. In fact, we will receive resurrection bodies. First, she says we aren't made of the same stuff we were made of in the past. Even now, our body is constituted with different particles, different cells than 5 or 10 years ago. And so it doesn't make much sense to say that we will be resurrected again with the same stuff that we had in this life. Second, a resurrected physical body would still be subject to death. Again, according to science, what is physical, what makes up our bodies now must die. And so even if it were somehow miraculously brought back together again, it would then have to die again. Third, she mentions the space problem, and that is if we resurrected every single individual who's ever lived in human history, we would have one heck of a space problem. They wouldn't all fit on this planet. Okay, she considers John Polkinghorne's revised account of bodily resurrection, that it isn't the same flesh that lives on, but the same pattern. So this is a modified view of the traditional Christian view that you are reconstituted or resurrected with the same molecular structure that you had before, and the same, made out of the same stuff. Polkinghorne says that it's not necessary that we're made out of the same stuff as long as we have the same pattern. She objects even to this, saying, well, we've got what's called the replica problem. Consider Jones 1, who was born and then dies, and perhaps someone along the way made a replica of Jones 1, call that person Jones 2, who fits the same pattern as Jones 1, but we would recognize just based on the thought experiment that Jones 2 is not the same as Jones 1, meaning they're 2 separate individuals, even though they both are based on the same pattern. And so this is, so pattern itself isn't sufficient to maintain personal identity through time and especially after death. She says, perhaps if there is such a thing as a human soul, then we can more successfully establish the continuity of identity in the afterlife or after death. She considers some difficulties with this. This is called the dualist view. It's traced back to Rene Descartes and even before that. But she says the difficulty for dualism is the view that we are made out of a body and a soul, is that our selves or our mental selves seem intimately affected by body chemistry. This is just an objection to dualism in general, that it poses the question, why is it that when our brains are affected by something such as a disease or an injury, that our minds are also affected by it? This is just the standard objection to Descartes' substance dualism. She raises a second difficulty, and that is in the form of a question: do animals have souls too? The Christian needs to explain this, she thinks. Difficulty 2A, I call it, is did souls evolve from non-souled ancestors? Based on the theory of evolution, we would have to suppose that the Christian account would mean that at some point back in human history, that a souled being came from a non-souled creature. And she says that's hard to believe. Difficulty number 3, if souls are understood as conscious entities, their persistence is undermined by breaks in consciousness. So again, if we define a soul as something that's mental or something that you are aware of having, it's your mental life, then how do we explain these breaks in consciousness? Every night you fall asleep and then you wake back up, but that would be a break in your identity if indeed we were to base personal identity through time on this notion of consciousness. And difficulty number 4, we've got the replica problem again. What if we created a copy of your soul, an additional soul? Which soul would be yours? Clearly they aren't the same, they're separate souls, but we've got a difficulty here, which is exacerbated if you have a break in the timeline death and then resurrection, if you have a break between one's death and one's resurrection. Badham says, quote, a dualist definition of what I really am fails because it cannot provide adequate criteria for recognizing the same person through change. That takes us to the next article, which is called Brain Science and the Soul. Donald Mackay's thesis is the Christian doctrine of resurrection can be shown to be logically coherent by comparing the difference between mind and body to a mathematical equation or software running on a computer or hardware. So, quote, he says, the behavior of the computer is determined by the equation. That's how we understand the computer as on a materialistic basis. We understand that it has this hardware and it is determined by the equation that it's running on it. He asks, are the equation and the hardware both reducible to physics? Maybe, except that we say the equation runs on the computer and can be made to run on a different computer if the hardware fails. Hence, the equation isn't the computer. It is embodied in the hardware, not identified with it. Mackay says, we are thinking, quote, of a mental activity as embodied in brain activity rather than identical with brain activity. So perhaps a mind can be made to run in a resurrected body as Christianity teaches. He's just trying to show that the Christian doctrine of the survival of one's death is at least not incoherent. You can show that by drawing the analogy between the mind and the software that might be run on a computer. Third article, the resurrection of the dead. Stephen T. Davis's thesis is to defend a temporary disembodiment account as a possible interpretation of the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. He examines three ways to understand the resurrection typically in Christian circles. First, or traditionally, is the resurrection of the physical body. This is the idea that our material body is resurrected, and in fact, all the same stuff is resurrected after death. The second is a dualist account, which we've already examined, and that is just the resurrection of the soul. He comments that he finds that this doctrine is held more often these days than in the past. And for whatever reason, the first doctrine of the resurrection of the physical body has been forgotten, even though it was the traditional Christian doctrine. The resurrection of the soul just is that we survive the death of our bodies by our soul going to heaven and living with God forever in a disembodied state forever. He doesn't think that's supported by scripture or the tradition. And so he proposes a third option, a third way, and that's called temporary disembodiment, where we are essentially body and soul, or body and mind, but we can exist disembodied temporarily between death and our resurrection. He thinks that we are complete only if we have both our body and our soul together, but it is possible that God might maintain one without the other. He starts to discuss three aspects of temporary disembodiment, his account or his proposal. He examines the intermediate state. The intermediate state is one in which we live without our bodies with God, and there are a number of things true of that state, which I'll show you on the next slide. The second one is the raising of the body, and the third is the glorified body. The body that is raised is going to be different from the body that we have in this life. So let's look at the intermediate state, page 315. He says that the intermediate state has temporary existence. It doesn't last forever. It lacks corporeality, meaning there's no body involved. It lacks spatial location. It lacks physical perceptions. It lacks sensory pleasures and pains. And it lacks bodily activities. Like you're not going to be playing baseball in heaven without a body. Second, it involves raising of the body, page 316. So at some point, the body and soul are reunited. This is the resurrection. And traditionally, it's thought that the same particles of matter come together, the same ones that constituted you on earth. Next, it's the glorified body. So the body that you are resurrected in is different from the body that you exist in now in some ways. There are new, better properties. It's spiritual, meaning that not that it's immaterial, but that it doesn't have the sinful flesh, as Christians say, anymore. It has no defect, no suffering, no aging, no death, no nourishment that's required, no unfulfilled desires. So now he considers some objections to his proposal. And the first one is directed at the traditional notion that resurrection requires sameness of parts. Does continuity of identity require sameness of parts, he asks? Well, he considers two thought experiments. One is the computer problem, and that is, imagine that his laptop broke down, and he thought he was smart enough to fix it himself, so he started disassembling it, and he ended up with 60 parts on his desk, only then realizing that he wasn't smart enough to fix it himself. So he takes those parts down to the computer store, and what happens is, by accident, the guy at the computer store mails off his parts to 60 different locations across the United States, and now realizing his mistake, tries to get them back. Two things might result from this. He might indeed actually get the parts back eventually, he says, after 3 years or so, and reassemble it into the form that it originally took and give it back to him. And the second scenario is that he never gets those parts back and instead orders new parts that are similar to the old parts, reassembles it, and the computer looks the same as it did, gives it back to him. And the question is, in both cases, is he getting the same computer back? Well, Davis thinks that in the first case, at least, we would all say, yes, he is getting the same computer back, even if there is a break in time between when the computer was disassembled and reassembled. In the second case, he's not so sure that we're getting the same computer back, but he doesn't see that there's any contradiction in saying that it is the same. In the second thought experiment, the teletransporter, this is like a Star Trek, beam me up, Scotty example. In this science fiction example, a person is beamed to another location in the galaxy, so like beamed to Mars, for example. If what happens in the beaming process or in the teletransporter process is that the molecules of the individual at point A are disassembled and then reassembled at point B, is it still the same person? Well, he thinks there are different views on this, and each of these views are equally rational and plausible. So he's not committed to there being, a firm answer to this question, but he says that it is possible that it is the same person. At least there's no logical contradiction in it being the same person that ends up at point B. And so in the same way, these thought experiments show that it's at least logically possible that the individual who's resurrected by God after death is the same person as the one who existed before death, even if the molecules that make up that person are not the same. He considers several other concerns that theologians throughout the ages have wrestled with, such as what if a Christian dies at sea and God wants to resurrect him or her, that Christian, who's now been eaten by fish, and those fish have swam off into various corners of the globe. How is that possible for that Christian to be resurrected? How is it possible that God's going to collect all those parts and back into one place? And he thinks that, well, if God is omnipotent, it's clear that he could do that, but he thinks that it's not necessary that we have God collecting all the same parts in order to retain personal identity. The second example is, well, what if that same Christian were to be eaten by cannibals, and now the parts of that individual are entangled in the bodies of these cannibals? How would God then separate or disentangle these parts from the cannibals in order to resurrect them? And then moreover, what if these cannibals became Christians and were to be resurrected themselves? How would God do it? So these are questions that remain unanswered. But the point is, Stephen Davis is saying that it is not necessary for retaining personal identity that God reassemble all of the original parts, as long as the essential parts are there. Next, he takes on the idea of the incoherence of disembodied existence. And in this, he's interacting with a book that I've used for many years in Intro to Philosophy called A Dialogue on Personal Identity and Immortality by John Perry. And the character in the book is an atheist. Her name is Gretchen Weirrob, and as the story goes, she's in a hospital bed dying, and her friend, who's a Christian, comes in and tries to persuade her that she actually has a chance to survive the death of her body, and she should take comfort in that. Well, Gretchen Weiraw, being the atheist character and being like a Hume, a David Hume skeptic, has several objections to these arguments. First, she says, souls can't serve as evidence for personal identity, meaning that because you can't see a soul, souls are invisible, and even when I interact with somebody in person, I don't see if they have a soul, I can't see it. So I can't test to know for sure whether the same soul exists in this individual as it did, a week ago. I can't also tell whether the one soul in that individual is not more than one, like it could be 3 or 4 who are just passing through the body as tourists or something. There's no way to know, and so Gretchen thinks that this can't serve as evidence for personal identity. Second, memories can't serve as evidence either. Just because you remember being the same person a week ago or having memories years ago that you attribute to yourself doesn't mean that it doesn't serve as evidence, because those could just be apparent memories. Go back to the replica problem or the problem of cloning. It is, at least in a science fiction idea, possible to create a clone with all the memories that the original had. And if memories are the criterion for deciding whether you're the same person through time, then there'd be no way to distinguish between the original and a clone, or Jones 1 and Jones 2. Finally, she objects that the possibility of God created replicas make the survival of death impossible. So if it's up to God to resurrect our bodies at a later time, it's possible for him to create a replica of us in heaven as well. And if it's possible to do that, he could make 2, 3, 4, 5 replicas. And that would be problematic for distinguishing the original from just mere copies. And so this is not a good, she thinks this is not a good criterion for determining or preserving personal identity through time, especially after death. So Stephen T. Davis has several responses to these objections, and here they are. So again, I have the numbered objections are the atheist objections, and those arrows right below it represent Stephen Davis's responses. So again, number 1, souls can't serve as evidence for personal identity. He replies, maybe not, but they might serve as the criteria. In other words, if what Gretchen is looking for, or the atheist is looking for evidence that we can know for sure that someone is the same person through time, maybe we can't have that. But souls might be the criteria, meaning we might not know that the individual has the same soul, but if in fact they do have the same soul, then their personal identity is preserved. I hope that makes sense. Secondly, the objection was from the atheist, memories can't serve as evidence either. And Stephen Davis says maybe not, but they might serve as the criteria. Same kind of response. As long as the person's memories are not just apparent memories, ones that have been artificially created, but are actually caused in the right way or had in the right way, then they could serve as the criteria that would preserve identity, personal identity through time. And third, the possibility of God created replicas makes the survival of death impossible. Yes, this is possible. So Stephen Davis actually grants this partially, but he responds that if God refrains from making replicas, the uniqueness of the surviving individual preserves their identity. So in other words, he leaves the response to this objection in the hands of God. As long as God refrains from making a clone or making a replica of you in the afterlife, then you are you as the single individual. So this is called a criterion of uniqueness. So as long as you are the only one that exists and there are no clones made, then your identity is preserved. But the moment that God makes a clone or a replica, then you are lost. I don't know if that gives away too much, but I hope the summary, at least, of these 3 articles is helpful to you.